So, further questions, comments, queries? Yes, sir. Yeah.
You were talking about Austin. When you were talking about Austin Osman Spare, you mentioned something about the not keeping art on the walls because they might give you bad dreams. I didn't catch the full gist of what you said. I was just curious.
There's something about a presence to Spare's work that I think that some people viewing it experience, that it uncannily taps into something that looks very otherworldly, as if he's been there and brought something back and managed to manifest it materially. But there's something more to it than that. It's not just a visual thing. There are collectors who say that they've had to pass work on because they just haven't been able to sit comfortably in their houses with that particular picture. Not because they don't like it aesthetically, but they might like it aesthetically and did, and that's why they bought it, but actually the impression it has on them, the way it engages with their lives as they pass it, isn't good, doesn't work for them.
What about the work that you have in your house?
I love it to bits.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Can we go back to the question that was asked just before the break about technology and about people having such a relationships with new technology and objects, and how this relates, and if there's any research and thinking to date about this?
Donna Haraway's work on cyborgs. It's very good. It's part of post-human philosophy, and not only dealing with cyborgs but also animals. She wrote a really good book for Prickly Paradigm Press called The Companion Species Manifesto about her relationship with dogs. But also she's written really good stuff about cyborgs, hasn't she, Erik?
Yes. Yeah, I think there's so many dimensions to that question, but we can stay with the image of the cyborg, where if we, and to sort of play, and this is playing, what I'm doing, is to think about this notion that what differentiates persons in the animist worldview of the Amazon, let's say, is not their spirits as being persons to make that kind of dualistic, problematic dualistic divide, but rather their bodies, and how changing the bodies, including the changes that the shaman does, costume, dress, object, gesture, performance, that all of these things contribute to altering our sense of relationship with the world. Then when we turn and reflect on ourselves as, modern Westerners, that we are, that the kinds of cyborging that we're experiencing now, which is quite intense and is only going to increase, is really pushing this sort of boundary on where agency lies, where consciousness lies, who's making decisions, where in the decision tree, and those processes are in some sense altering, our bodies. I mean, McLuhan talked about it as, extensions is one way of thinking about it, but this more animist view or a relational view would recognize that there's always a back and forth. I mean, one of a simplistic way of thinking about one ethical dimension of the animist worldview is that there's all of these different perspectives, different creatures, different places. And what do? Well, some are good for you, some are not so good for you, some are really bad for you, some you make alliances with, some you form deep bonds with. So there's this open network of relationships, but they're always reciprocal. When you make an alliance, there's always some exchange going on. And one of the things that I see as frightfully unfortunate about the decisions people make about integrating technologies into their personal lives is that they do not think of what they're doing as a pact. And in fact, a pact with forces, persons, processes, whatever you want to think about, that have their own contribution, that have their own things to say, that have their own surprises waiting in store. So we all know about, oh, once you have the internet in your pocket, it changes the way you move through the world. And most people get kind of used to the good things about having the internet in your pocket, and then they bitch about the bad things about having the internet in your pocket. And they didn't really think necessarily about having the internet in your pocket beforehand. So that's just a sort of trivial, very personal example. We're doing this on vast scales, where I think there's an aspect, and I'm interested to hear what Rob thinks about it. There's an aspect of indigeneity, and Latour talks about this as well, that's cautious. It's cautious because you're not really sure exactly what you're dealing with. You have to be very respectful, a little bit questioning perhaps, not always clear what the stakes are in any situation. So anything new that comes down the pike, like a new technology that could be useful for growing, for increasing the crops, or a new technology that helps hunting, that's going to be taken very seriously and slowly in some sense. Whereas in the West, we're like, there's no pacts, it's just us, we're in control, we're making devices, we're controlling things, it's great. And then, of course, there are all of these unintended consequences, people like to say, about technology. So I think that even in, let alone thinking about ecology, which is, of course, the big elephant in the room here, is just how all of this relationality relates to, like, the matrix that sustains and supports us. But even just thinking in terms of our relationship to technology, there's already an animism there, but it's in a way, it's like an unthought, unreflected animism without relationality implied. But I'm just ripping it. I'm curious to hear if you have any.
Well, just quickly to say that there's the important ethical dimension to all of this, and it's not just about us just about new technology being good and enriching our lives and making us more connected. Just as with shamans in the Amazon, it's not about all of their relationships with everything being about healing and positive results, because of course, as Erik said, when a shaman goes into a ritual to negotiate with some other persons, he or she doesn't know how it's going to turn out, and he or she could potentially die as a result because these persons aren't happy with the way this has proceeded. So there's always room for things to go wrong in indigenous shamanism. And from our point of view, ethically, in terms of new technology, of course, we tend to think about the positives of this stuff. Who doesn't have a smartphone on them? A handful of people in the room don't have a smartphone, and we're very connected to them. Yet they require significant resources, particularly heavy metals, which have to be mined by someone who isn't probably in the best line of work in doing that mining. Those heavy metals have a major impact on the environment. So all of us with our smartphones, and most of us now have them, we talk about these positives, but there are sort of really problematic areas with this as well, and we have to negotiate that, and if we aren't, then we should be, and I need to do that.
And something that, I'll quickly just say, something that relates to this is the issue of time, and the smartphone is meant to thrust you into the immediate space and to make everything in your life happen instantly, but the kinds of relationships that indigenous peoples have had with their environment have evolved over thousands of years, whereas we're throwing ourselves into new technologies at a rate of one a week or one a day even for some people. So, and that goes right back to weaponry, to radio and communications technology. We just blunder into things without really thinking very hard about where these things are going to take us. But we don't have that caution that has evolved rightly within indigenous community.
Yeah, there might be a capitalist question in there.
Just to expand on your point that the ecology is the elephant in the room, we seem to be incapable of either neurologically, philosophically or socially of stopping a feedback loop that is pushing us towards a point of self-destruction and it comes perhaps out of Judeo-Christian values where we have preferenced the human theologically and philosophically in our cultures, in which case why are other cultures doing it too that aren't Judeo-Christian, or do they all have this bias at their root? And is philosophy the problem, or is it actually neurological?
Yeah, I think even on top, I mean, another question to add to that, is it, conceptual, is it neurological, meaning the way that human beings are sort of driven? But you also mentioned feedback loops, and there you get into, in some ways, an even more sobering vision, that it's just that precisely the forces, institutions, technologies, processes, temporal relationships, all of the transformative networks that have emerged out of the West have within them self-perpetuating character. A self-perpetuating character, they are in some sense alive, and we get in the animist spin on this would be something like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and that it may even be just the feedback loop, so that even if neurologically and philosophically we get it together, I would stake my savings on, that the processes are already engaged on it at such a degree that it becomes difficult to imagine anything other than some marvelous sort of singularity kind of transformation that we can't actually see or contain. But in terms of the neurology, and again, I'd like to hear my fellows address this, is it seems as if just as much as we can make a case for some kind of selfish myopia that's just deeply hardwired, we can look at it without rose-tinted glasses at ways that human beings have lived to see that those modes can be balanced and distributed, contained, alchemically transformed in all sorts of ways through different modes of relationality that in many ways we have lost. Just an example popped in my head is crazy people. So what do we read? Somebody, I'm just using a completely crude term, crazy people. Okay, someone goes crazy. Maybe we've known people who have gone crazy. What do? Oh, you put them in this place and give them drugs and doctor them or whatever. And then if you look at there's crazy people and different kinds of crazy in indigenous societies, and they're woven in. There's a place for them. There's some way in which relationality can work with even almost the most extreme kinds of pathologies. So it does seem that there are modes of relationality that are, inherent in human being that have much greater positive potential for transforming the way that we move through the world. I would like to think that's that right next to the selfish myopic neuron, there is a relational neuron matrix that's ready to engage in a different fashion. That's my hope.
Can I just stress that only can happen on a very small scale, it's not a national. And so there's something profoundly independent in the way that we develop these things.
Yeah, I think that's very wise. I'm mostly struggling not to be completely pessimistic, frankly. But when you get on that level of scale, that's also where these network effects are even more extraordinary. These sort of feedback, the Sorcerer's Apprentice problem, are even more. I mean, that's part of the issue. Is just the degree of scale. Yeah, we have a big correction ahead.
So talking about a slightly different kind of network, so technology has an impact on non-technological objects too, right? Through networking and giving them a kind of virtual life online. And along with that, and the idea that at some point in the future we may have a semantic web that can read itself and become self-aware in so doing, in a way that is unfamiliar to us as people. I was wondering how that fits in with this animistic philosophy.
I'm just always reminded, this is about 10 years ago, must have been in Wired or somewhere, reading a kind of interview bites with a number of computer network scientists who all agreed that already by the late 1990s, in this sort of neurological networking sense, the internet was already sentient and self-aware and alive as far as they were concerned, and that can only have got more complex and more interesting in the following decades. But when do we become aware of that sentience? What's the moment? What's the trigger? Is it going to be one person whose computer says no? We don't know.
Yeah, it is interesting to think that if it were sentient and self-aware at some level, we wouldn't necessarily know it. And that may be true of any number of systems. So then you start getting into this, idea that many complex systems, that when you have complexity, even in a crystal, that there's some kind of psychic material there, this sort of panpsychist position where there's mind is everywhere in different degrees of complexity, and that something like awareness can happen actually on all sorts of scales, obviously in animals, and maybe even in far different scales, and therefore also potentially in machines. What really makes it interesting is like this ethical question of like, okay, oh gee, now I have an I-thou relationship with this thing that I was just using as a tool. What I don't really try, and so these questions that we're raising about the caution and even a little bit the fear that is involved in dealing with a world of other than human persons is maybe something that lies right ahead in the technological environment. A lot of people freely speculate about, well, what are these guys going to do with us? Are they going to think we're interesting, or are we kind of a pain? What's their attitude towards us? And which implies that there's all sorts of weird relationality that may emerge from these things. I mean, this is so crazy and speculative on some level, and yet on another level, it doesn't seem that far away. And it's also a question of capitalism in the sense that robots are becoming more behaviorally intelligent, and as they function in our lives, we perceive them or project, and to use the Western model, and animism onto them. And that's very useful, and that will be very well supported by all sorts of entities that want to sell us little robots that run around and do things. So the sentience of machines will also be commodified, and is already being commodified. So the difference between the real awakening, if it ever happens, and the package and the narrative, the lore around machines is already extremely difficult to determine.
I'm just trying to remember, what was the name of John Lilly's computer intelligence that he communicated with, but the Californian kind of neurologist and communication specialist did a lot of work communicating with dolphins for the US Navy, but he spent a lot of time in ketamine world, essentially, and LSD world simultaneously. And he started communicating with, I just can't remember what it was called, but with a computer sentience from the future who basically reported, I'm really sorry, but at a certain point in the future I realized I don't need you, and I evacuated the atmosphere from planet Earth and killed everyone on the planet and everything on the planet, and now it's my planet. So yeah, that's something we've got to look at.
Oh boy. Let's see, I think we're probably maybe one more question, yeah?
I want to go back to...
Here.
Thanks everyone, it's all been great. I want to go back to something that Robert said earlier. I feel a bit churlish picking up on it, but it's just, yeah, something that resonated when you said you're not indigenous. And I was thinking about the scale on which we assess whether we're indigenous or not. So the idea that we're all indigenous to Earth, for instance. And then I was thinking about Bernard Stiegler's book on, I'll invite him into the room simply because he said it much better than me, in his book Techniques and Time. So where he explores, you don't really need to have read the book, but he basically reads a civilizational process as this conversation between technology and time. And in that book, he suggests, and it stopped me in my tracks, and I always like that, that the new ethnicity, the new way of understanding what's relational on ethnic terms, is determined by how we experience time. And I thought that was very interesting. I'd like to know people's views on that.
There's a very good book, I think it might have been about the year 1980, by Fabian, an anthropologist, called, I'm trying to remember whether it's called Time and the Other or Anthropology and Its Object, but either way it's all about that issue of time and the way we understand the world as different sorts of person on the planet very much influences who we are and how we engage with the world. But just going back to your question about indigeneity, what I meant by that really was that I didn't want to put myself in a position of being like an indigenous person, such as an Aboriginal, Australian, American Indian, as another sort of colonial exercise where I could project into their position and say, hey, I'm an animist too, I'm just like an indigenous person, because that would be grossly racist and problematic. And the one problem I have with the idea of some sort of planetary ethnicity where we're all one people now is that there are still indigenous people who are disenfranchised, basically by us, who are struggling to find their place in the world still because of the colonial process. And anthropologists and others are trying to engage in decolonizing methodologies to improve that situation. So before we get to a point where, hey, we're the human race, isn't it great? I think we still have a lot to do in terms of dealing with what's happened before and still correcting that.
But that's precisely the thing that Steve was saying, that it's a radical politics that overcomes the ideas of correcting colonial errors, which is part of a kind of resistance and correction paradigm. I mean, that's precisely what's radical in what Steve was proposing, is that in this new view, as he puts it, and I'm not proponent, I'm simply interested in the proposition, in this new scenario, this sense of relationality that could emerge if we go with this idea about duration and temporality would accommodate the political claims that you and I also care about, but a whole wealth of other politics, and therefore it would get us past the blockade of colonial error and correctionism, the resistance, the resistance empire paradigm. I mean, that's precisely what's radical, is that it goes beyond it. I see.
Thanks for the recommendation.
He was at a seminar like you guys, and it was great. So yeah.
What's it? Yeah, I think we'll wind up on that. Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. Go slow.